CODEPINK Congress. I am thrilled to be with you tonight, along with my co-host, Colonel Ann Wright, a diplomat in her own right. Cole Harrison, Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action. Hania Jadad Barnes, an organizer with Roots Action, Middle East Alliances of Progressive Democrats of America. And I think Brian Garvey will be joining us as well. He is also with Massachusetts Peace Action. Tonight, we're looking at diplomacy. What happened to it? How do we revive this lost art we desperately needed, right? As we face a hot war in Ukraine, a proxy war between the United States and Russia, a very dangerous situation. We are all aware of that. We're going to be talking about that tonight with Chas Freeman, Ambassador Chas Freeman, who has a long resume, and we'll be introducing him in a little bit. And then Professor Jeffrey Sachs will be coming to us via video. So we'll be talking about Ukraine, we'll talk about Yemen, we'll talk about China. And first, we're going to have some updates. So Hania, take it away.
Most certainly. And again, good evening to you, every single one of you who's here, who's joined us at 5 o'clock. Delighted to have you. Just a quick update on Iran and what's happened with the morality police. Some Western media outlets just recently, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, just recently faced a ton of backlash from Iranian activists over headlines claiming that Iran has abolished or is abolishing its morality police. Just a few days ago, the New York Times published an inaccurate article quoting one of Iran's elected officials, Attorney General Mohammad Javad Mortazavi, who was asked over the weekend about why the country's morality police, or what we call in Farsi, Gasht Irshad, had become inactive. And he replied that the morality police had nothing to do with the judiciary, and the same institution that established it now has shut it down. Well, just a quick background on the morality police. The Guidance Patrol has never been a police unit, so it cannot be abolished technically. This program could be paused or continued depending on whether there is a hardliner president in Iran or someone who is more on the moderate side, but it is, and it pretty much resembles what we have here, which is the stop and frisk. But the decision to dismantle the morality police technically lies within the Supreme Council of Cultural Revolution, which is a body that was established in the early 1980s by Iran's first supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini. And right now, as it currently stands today, it is headed by President Ebrahim Raisi. The comments by the Attorney General came just a couple of days after pro-reform outlet Entekhab reported him saying that Iran's parliament and judiciary were reviewing the country's mandatory hijab laws that have been in place since 1983. Anyone who is currently following the Iran protests knows that problems in Iran go much deeper than just the hijab. Hijab is one of the biggest issues, but it is more of a freedom to choose for women. And again, time and time again, we have stood in solidarity with our sisters and people of Iran.
Okay, let's go to Ann Wright, Colonel Ann Wright. She's been a long time CODEPINK sister, and she's going to be helping moderate tonight because she's got a lot of experience as a diplomat herself. So Ann, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days in Hawaii with Red Hill, and then update us on Ukraine, NATO, all of that in a couple of minutes.
Well, yes, a couple of minutes, I can do that, no problem. I am here at home in Hawaii, where we are challenging the U.S. Navy's pollution of everything we've got, from our water, of 19,000 gallons of jet fuel a year ago that went into the drinking water of 17 different communities around the Pearl Harbor base. And then just last week, here was anywhere from 1,100 to 1,400 gallons of AFFF, which is otherwise known as PFAS, aqueous firefighting foam, that is really, really nasty and poisonous. It just leaked out of the same tunnels where we've had jet fuel. So here in Hawaii, we're having lots of demonstrations and putting pressure on the Navy, which has said it will close down the massive 220 underground tanks that hold 250 million gallons of jet fuel. Okay, so that's Hawaii. plus a little action with our volcano over on Big Island that is actually putting lava down into the Pohakaloa military training area that has lots of unexploded ordnance there because it's one of the big bombing ranges the military has. So there will probably be some big explosions, not just for the volcano, but the lava going over some of this unexploded ordnance. But now to other explosions on the war in Ukraine, where the cold weather setting in, the Russian government has targeted civilian infrastructure. Apparently the Ukrainians have hit back with some drones that have hit air bases within 200 miles inside the Russian border. And that should probably escalate what's going to be happening there. On other issues of NATO, besides NATO coming out here into the Pacific, we have NATO expansion in Europe, where Finland and Sweden have both applied for NATO membership, and particularly the accession of Sweden is being held up by Turkey. Turkey wants to have Sweden extradite Kurdish activists who have sought refuge in Sweden. So that and the fact that what we had hoped would be talks between Russia and the US on the START treaty has now been postponed. So that's a thumbnail sketch of crises in Europe and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Ann Wright, and we'll be going into those topics in greater depth with Ambassador Chas Freeman, who will be joining us in just a moment. I also wanted to draw your attention to the chat, where Maha is posting some links to articles that may be of interest. Medea Benjamin, who couldn't join us tonight because she's on a nationwide book tour, she's in Houston. She wrote an excellent article with Nicholas J.S. Davies, the co-author of her book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, an article on 8 reasons why now is the time to support a ceasefire and negotiations in Ukraine. And then we're also posting my article, Letter to the Left on Ukraine, because we've all probably noticed that there are a few on the left who think that we should continue to arm the Ukrainians. So my response, we have to look at how we have provoked this, and we have to look at why a military solution is not possible, really. Okay, so moving on, let's take a look at what's going on in Palestine. Cole.
Sure. So all this year, the violence and destruction have been increasing in Palestine. The situation is increasingly tense. Settler violence is escalating without much intervention by Israeli soldiers or police. I think over 200 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces this year alone. And now, of course, there's a new far-right coalition government coming in Israel, the farthest right Israel has ever elected. And the coalition agreement between the right-wing parties was published yesterday. And Bezalel Smotrich, who is the head of a party called Religious Zionism, he's a far-right settler known for Jewish supremacist rhetoric. He will be in charge of administering the Palestinian settlements within the Defense Department. So that's an extremely problematic situation, almost guaranteed to produce conflict. So we really need to be concerned with what U.S. policy is going to be. Marcy, if I could actually, well, I was going to mention, we're going to hold a CODEPINK Congress session January 3rd on this very topic. So stand by for that, first one in the new year. And if I could just sneak in a word about the NDAA, the conferees announced the National Defense Authorization bill last week, and it's $858 billion, which is the largest ever, and $45 billion more than President Biden asked for. So we're expecting the House to vote on that any day, and it will be important to rally votes against it.
Yes, and we'll be doing that tonight, so do stay with us.
Oh, great. Okay.
We'll be following up on 2 actions tonight to support the Christmas truce, the call for a Christmas truce in Ukraine, as well as phoning. We're going to get on our cell phones and call Capitol Hill and say, vote no against the NDAA.
Great.
Thank you, Cole. Brian Garvey is also with Massachusetts Peace Action, and he has an update on Yemen.
Hello, everyone. Great to be back with you, and great to report some good news came through this morning. The Intercept reported that Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who has been a longtime advocate for an end to the U.S. role, really facilitation of the Saudi-led war in Yemen, is going to bring his privileged war powers resolution to the floor as early as next week. Now, this is something that advocates and activists have been pushing for since the Biden administration began. We've been pushing for years, even before then. But to challenge the Biden administration just as much as Congress challenged Donald Trump when he was president, which is, a little politically difficult for the Democrats in Congress. But the people of Yemen, who have endured now over 7 years of blockade and bombing campaigns by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and their allies, need continued relief. Since the introduction of the War Powers Resolution back earlier this year, there has been a fragile truce. That truce has expired, but even so, the parties continue to observe that truce, and more or less, and the Saudis have not resumed the bombing campaign in the way they have done in the past. And activists feel that that has a lot to do with that War Powers Resolution that's hanging over their heads. Because if they resume their bombing campaign, then this privileged piece of legislation can kick in, and if it does, it'll limit all U.S. support for the Saudi Royal Air Force. And just to let you know how important that is, U.S. contractors with the authority of the Department of Defense, they service these planes every time they take off and land. Without the spare parts and the service, the Saudi Royal Air Force essentially becomes very expensive paperweights. So it's a huge threat. It's a huge piece of leverage that can be used to really provide this much needed relief to the people of Yemen. As we know, Congress is about to change over, right? The Democrats are going to lose control of the House of Representatives. The GOP is going to take power. And that's why it is so important to get a vote on this right now. Because in the House of Representatives, there's about 120 co-sponsors already, people who have signed up to support this, which is no small feat, let me tell you. 120 co-sponsors is considerably more than it got when it passed and made it all the way to the president's desk back in 2018. But now we have a president who has said he would do the kind of things that are in this resolution. So it makes it much harder for him not to pass that resolution.
So we're gonna tell our senators.
Yeah, you got to tell your senators, got to tell the people in the House. And one more reason, and this touches on the little partisan things that politicians care a lot about. Saudi Arabia really did put their hand in our recent midterm elections. That cut in oil productions amounts to some election interference. And, with the margins being as close as they are in the House, who's to say that that didn't have a difference? And if Congress doesn't do anything, who's to say they won't interfere in the 2024 election? And we know who the Saudi government prefers was in the Oval Office. So just another reason for you to tell your reps.
All right.
The War Powers Resolution.
Thank you very much, Brian Garby with Massachusetts Peace Action. We will look forward to the reintroduction of that Yemen War Powers Resolution by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Now, Ann Wright, who resigned from the State Department over the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, is our special guest moderator tonight, and she's going to introduce our first guest.
Thank you, Marcy. And it is a real pleasure for me as a former diplomat to introduce one of the diplomats who I think really makes a difference. In his retirement out of the State Department, after he had been in for nearly 40 years, including times as being the interpreter for President Nixon when he went to the historic visit to China in 1972, and then being the director of the Chinese Affairs Department at State Department. He was the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. a principal deputy assistant secretary of state for African affairs. He was the chargé d'affaires or the acting ambassador in our embassy in China and also in Thailand. He has a wealth of experience and could take up this full hour. In fact, we need to invite him back for a whole hour's worth. But what we're so pleased, Ambassador Freeman, that you're with us to give us a thumbnail sketch on what's happening with diplomacy. Is it keeping the world more peaceful, or is the diplomacy doing exactly what the administration may be wanting, which is maybe not so peaceful things? So Ambassador Freeman, it's all yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Marcy. Also, it's a pleasure to be with you. I think in order to do diplomacy, you need to know what it is, and it's time to recognize that our country has a statecraft deficit sustained by a diplomacy-free foreign policy. We don't know how to use measures short of war to solve problems, how to avoid starting wars, how to gain anything but more debt from them, or how to terminate them. We demand professionalism and proven competence from our military, but we're content with amateurism and mediocrity in our diplomacy. And how did this happen? Well, for the first 120 years of our history, we were either content behind the two great oceans that separate us from Asia and Europe, or using our military to annex half of Mexico, engineer regime change elsewhere in Latin America, or kill indigenous peoples. After a brilliant start, people like Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and so forth, as an independent nation, we imagined that unskilled fat cats and political cronies were good enough for diplomatic work. In 1917, we sent troops to Europe, where they tipped the balance of World War I. Our president, an academic with no diplomatic experience named Woodrow Wilson, had some untested theories about how the world should be run, and he tried them out at Paris at the Peace Conference after the war. Our allies cynically indulged him, but then our Congress repudiated the New World Order he'd proposed. We nonetheless decided to professionalize our diplomacy. In 1924, we created the Foreign Service of the United States, but we continued to appoint wealthy dilettantes with few relevant skills to represent us abroad. In Asia and Europe, our foreign policy was isolationist and consisted almost entirely of denunciations of foreigners and other affirmations of our presumed moral superiority. This annoyed the foreigners concerned, but had almost no practical effect on them. Outside our sphere of influence in the Americas, we were all talk and no action. And then in 1941, we implemented one of Wilson's most appealing theories, that economic deprivation could be as crippling as military assault, and imposed sanctions on Japan. The Japanese saw this as an act of war, a bullying existential threat, and responded at Pearl Harbor. When the dust from World War II settled, our armed forces dominated Asia and all but Eastern Europe and the northern half of Korea. In an amazing flash of statecraft, we led the creation of an international system based on an analog to the rule of law. In theory, this created a universal set of rules for international interactions. In practice, it established American spheres of influence in Asia and Western Europe, opposed to the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. Our grand strategy rested on a judgment by George Kennan, a professional diplomat stationed in Washington, that if the Soviet Union were politically and economically walled off from the West, it would collapse of its own infirmities. It took 42 years to prove Kennan right. By then, we had become habituated to military confrontation with Moscow and developed vested interests in a vast military-industrial congressional complex. This made it convenient to interpret the Soviet decision to stop competing with us as a military victory rather than the triumph of diplomatic strategy and reason that it was. It's clear to us that the only language foreigners understand is the use of force, or failing that, economic coercion. But diplomacy is about persuading others to see and do things our way. It requires recognizing that the other side gets a vote in relationships, and that what seems self-evident to us may strike others as wrong-headed. It demands an open mind, open ears, and the ability to consider viewpoints other than our own. You won't find much empathy on our social media or in our diplomacy at present. We treat diplomatic dialogue as little more than the deceptive foreplay that precedes an intended assault. In fact, our diplomacy now is mostly aimed at appeasing domestic opinion rather than persuading foreigners to see their interests as we do. This is diplomacy as transnational con game. The only peace process now underway in the Holy Land is that in the minds of the gullible here. The Biden administration's opening move with the Chinese pandered to domestic xenophobia by publicly informing them that we would deal with them from a position of strength in order to keep them down. Then we added that there, of course, that there were a few things we needed China to do for us and suggested to get about doing them. Rather than restoring the nuclear deal with Tehran, the administration placated the Zionist lobby by doubling down on its predecessor's failed policy of maximum pressure on Iran. NATO was and is an alliance hostile to Russia. The administration refused to hear Moscow's objections to the deployment of NATO and US weaponry to Russia's borders. Our rejection of any effort to negotiate a peaceful modus vivendi between Russia and the US military sphere of influence in Europe helped bring on a war. Our response to Russian aggression relied on sanctions that produced a global energy and food crisis, crippled European economies, and pushed Russia closer to China while enriching our defense industry. We're not talking to Russia, and we have no strategy for ending the war in Ukraine or preventing it from escalating to the nuclear level. Now, this administration has no idea how to deprive North Korea of reasons or means to strike our country with its new nuclear-armed ICBMs. In Korea, we seem content to allow might to continue to make right. The result of all this is a deepening tragedy in Palestine, a rising danger of war with China, uninterrupted Iranian progress toward nuclear latency, a war in Ukraine likely to last until there are no Ukrainians left to oppose Russia's dismemberment of their country, and an ever more belligerent North Korea. Our role in these outcomes does not encourage our allies and partners to follow us. Now that we've convincingly demonstrated the ineptitude of military-based foreign policy, perhaps it's time to try diplomacy. The Constitution gave Congress the sole power to authorize wars of choice. It must reclaim its authority rather than continue to rubber stamp wars launched by the executive. We need to recognize that the number of problems with military solutions is limited. Consider non-military solutions to them and stop fomenting forever wars. Our diplomatic service needs professionalization. The Cold War taught our diplomats how to act as imperial administrators. They must now rediscover the forgotten arts of friendly persuasion, give and take, and war prevention. Diplomacy is the software of foreign policy. Without it, military hardware is likely to have a head crack. We need to fund non-military instruments of statecraft and to demand that the Senate disapprove nominees who are manifestly less qualified by experience or training to conduct diplomacy than our military is at the conduct of warfare. the bottom line is our country's margin for error is shrinking. We need a peaceful international environment to fix the many problems we have at home. To enable that, we've got to get our diplomatic act together. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Freeman. That's it's really an indictment on our own foreign policy and the diplomats that implement whatever the administrations that we elect come up with. Although I think behind the scenes, there's a certain amount of residual things that go on no matter who's in the administration. I know you speak a lot internationally and nationally, and in fact, you were at the National Defense University just a week or so ago. And one of the comments that you put in your speech there was about destroying things in order to save them. When I'm halfway out in the Pacific, could you talk a little bit about China and Taiwan and the U.S. relationship?
Well, the sad thing is that we had a formula that prevented war in the Taiwan Strait, was premised on allowing Chinese on both sides of the strait to solve their own problems and to do so peacefully. And we agreed with Beijing on a series of conditions, which they respected, and we, for long, also respected. We've basically gone back on all those commitments, and the framework for managing the relationship is now broken. So you hear the administration talking about fixing so-called guardrails on the relationship, which basically is a substitute for agreement with Beijing. This isn't going to work. For the Chinese, this is really an existential issue. Two revolutions in the last century were about unifying China and ending foreign spheres of influence on its territory. Taiwan has evolved, and it has become a robust democracy. It has a higher respect, frankly, for the rights of its citizens than we're demonstrating now. Its democracy is healthier. And we ought to be doing what we can to ensure that it continues to exist peacefully alongside the mainland, and demonstrating to people in China the merits of the democratic system. That's not what we're doing. We're preparing for war. And we have got the Chinese attention, much as we got the attention of the Japanese in 1941. They are heavying up their nuclear forces in order to be able to provide cover for a military operation to take Taiwan if they regard that as necessary. There's no diplomacy at all here, and there's hardly any talk, although Secretary Blinken is going to Beijing in the coming year. There's no indication that he has anything to present other than more of the same. So I come back to the thesis that if you want to do diplomacy, you need to know what it is, and you have to have people who are trained in it to do it. Secretary Blinken, with all due respect, is a congressional staffer who has been promoted above any reasonable pay grade. So I would say we need to, as I said at the end, we just need to get our act together. We have a lot of problems in this country, and we're neglecting them in favor of looking for monsters to destroy abroad.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Freeman, and for everyone, I'm sure would like to hear more from you and read more of your materials. And your website, chasfreeman.net, has transcripts from your speeches and one in particular I saw was on diplomatic policy, where you run through the diplomacy of all of the empires that we've seen in the world, with maps of who got what where. It's really fascinating. And we would like to ask everyone to unmute and give Ambassador Freeman a big round of applause for being with us today.
Yay.
Yay.
Good
job.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Nicely
much.
done. Nicely
Thank you.
done.
We appreciate your candid assessment of the current leadership in the State Department, backed with neoconservatives. As a Bernie delegate, 500 of us signed a letter to President Biden saying, fire your foreign policy staff, because it was clear before how dangerous the situation could become with the people he had chosen. So, I would say, I just want to encourage you, as though you need my encouragement, but to write as many op-eds as you can calling for diplomacy. Because you have the credibility, you have the gravitas, and we so desperately need it now. So thank you very much for joining
Well,
us.
thank you. And I wish you all a pleasant evening, and I will allow you to go on with your business
Okay.
with my enthusiastic support in the background. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So at this point, Maha, if you can put in the chat the link to the petition for the Christmas truce, that would be terrific. We can sign it. We can do it right now. Let's see, chasfreeman.com. Yeah, if you want to see all of his resources, and there are plenty, as Anne pointed out. Okay, there in the chat, you see, or you saw a link to a petition for a Christmas truce. And this is a spinoff of a statement that's been signed by over 700 religious leaders. It's a separate statement from faith-based leaders in the United States calling for President Biden and members of Congress to publicly support a Christmas truce in Ukraine. And this is reminiscent of the 1914 Christmas truce during World War I, when soldiers crossed enemy lines along the Western Front, something like 100,000 soldiers, and said, we don't want to continue with this. They put down their arms, and some of them mingled and socialized and even danced. What a time, right? So it is possible, and we hope that you will sign this during the course of this show and share it far and wide. Okay, the next part of our program, we have a video interview that I did with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's been, he's with Columbia University, but he's also a leader in sustainable development, and he's been an economic advisor to various continents and countries, including Russia. And I had an opportunity to talk to him recently for CODEPINK Radio, which airs on most Pacifica stations. If you have a college or community radio station in your town, in your city, please ask the program director, the general manager, to broadcast CODEPINK Radio. Great show. So Maha's going to cue up the video for us. Let's see what he has to say about prospects for diplomacy in Ukraine and the role of China in all of this.
No audio.
Give Maha a second to see if we can bring up the audio. He just today came out with another terrific article on diplomacy and how urgent it was that we practice this in Ukraine. Maha, what do you think?
Are you guys not able to hear the audio?
We can't hear him.
No, there was no audio when he was
Somebody said
speaking.
the person who's sharing the screen would
I'm
need
so
to
sorry.
also share computer audio.
Yep, this little box at the bottom left hand.
Oh, got it.
Share.
Sorry, everybody. Got it.
Done it a million
Thank
times.
you, Maha.
The United States, by all reports,
To all stakeholders in this.
the basic issues have been clear before there was a war. And there were 3 issues on the table before this war that could have been addressed to avoid the war. The same 3 issues were on the table in March when Russia and Ukraine came close to an agreement that the United States, by all reports that I've heard, talked them out of. And it's the same 3 issues that are on the table now. The first and most important is if Russia leaves, they don't want the United States filling in with NATO, period. So this has been the core from the beginning. And the United States doesn't have the decency to say we're not going to expand NATO. That's to save Ukraine, saying that, by the way. That's the compromise that saves Ukraine, because Russia is going to fight to prevent NATO enlargement to Ukraine, period. And so we never should have recommended this. That's the first item on the agenda. The second item on the agenda is Crimea. Crimea has been the home to the Russian fleet in the Black Sea since 1783. Give me a break. And before we overthrew Yanukovych, or helped to overthrow Yanukovych in 2014, Yanukovych, who was trying to balance between the two sides and not have Ukraine suffer a war between the US and Russia, was saying, well, Russia will have the rights to Crimea at least till 2041, and then with options for renewal. That was the pragmatic approach that a pragmatic president was trying to pursue. Now Zelensky says, oh, we're going to recapture every inch of it. Well, over all of our dead bodies will be the truth, because that is not going to happen without complete escalation to Armageddon. So the second issue is de facto Russian presence in Crimea, as it has been since 1783. And everybody knows this. Anybody serious knows this. But Zelensky, for whatever domestic political reasons, says things that just build the pressure that for escalation to complete disaster. And
Well,
we say,
I wonder
and
how long will the Biden administration put up with Zelensky? That's what I'm wondering.
And we sit there sucking our thumbs as this thing escalates to, even Biden said that it is on a path to Armageddon. And then he was quickly hushed up. Oh, don't say that. Don't tell the American people such things. Don't scare them. But, you know, even he said it a few weeks ago. So Zelensky, no. President Zelensky, you're not going to retake Crimea militarily, except over all of our dead bodies. It's not going to happen. General Milley knows it's not going to happen. I suspect President Biden knows it's not going to happen. And it's time for the president to be presidential and tell the truth about these things. Then the third issue that has been on the table, also from actually Ukraine's independence in 1992 onward, and then especially after Yanukovych's overthrow in 2014, is the Russian concentrated areas of the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk. And the idea after 2014 was an agreement. It was called the Minsk Agreements. And Minsk II said that there should be autonomy for those regions. And the Ukrainians signed it, and then they ripped it up. They said, we don't like it. We don't want to do those things. And Europe was supposed to be the guarantors of Minsk II, France and Germany. They turned their eyes. The United States didn't want to press. This is our government in Kyiv. And so there was no solution for the Donbass region. And before this year, this could have been settled on the basis of the Minsk II agreement, which only called for autonomy. It called for special arrangements signed by both sides. Then Russia upped the ante. It said, okay, now they're part of the Russian Federation. Then they added 2 more regions. Well, this is not exactly going in the right direction. This needs to be negotiated. I would not accept that these areas are all going to be Russian. I would not accept that at all in the negotiations, but we're not going to have to. This is what negotiations are about. That's why we need to start the negotiations right now. But we need to understand 3 issues on the table. One is non-NATO enlargement. Second is Crimea. And third is the Donbass. This is the basic issue. It's been the basic issue all along. We could have avoided this war by negotiating on these points. And this idea that it was a concession to give to Putin that NATO wouldn't enlarge. It wasn't a concession. It was sanity. That why should we want to push a U.S. military alliance right up against Russia's borders? Well, only if you have neocon reveries. That's the only consideration. Otherwise, any sane person in this country would know that's not a good idea. That's pretty reckless. Why don't we chill out a little bit and not have a war over it?
I'm with you 100%. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, what about China? We know that President Biden recently met with the leader of China, and they had a cordial meeting. Do you think China holds the cards here?
Well, the situation with China is the following. First, China would like this war to end. Second, China does not want NATO to enlarge. So the same issue we've been talking about is relevant for China. Why? Because these neocons are trying to enlarge NATO, which I hope people remember is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They want to enlarge NATO to the Pacific. And this is a kind of nuttiness that actually was shown at this year's NATO meeting when they invited Asian leaders, Asian allied leaders to NATO. How reckless can one be? This really is the neocon vision that, U.S. military alliances encircle the world and encircle China and encircle Russia and so forth. And that's the path. So my point is to come back to your question about the role of China. China does not want this war, but China does not want to underwrite NATO enlargement at all. And that's why the Chinese government has rightly said, not wrongly, but rightly said all the time, that we need a negotiated solution that also respects Russia's security needs. That's not cynical. People should understand what that means. It means that NATO doesn't enlarge to Ukraine. Very simple. And that's the terms on which China will help to be a guarantor for peace. It doesn't help that, we're absolutely provoking a similar conflict across the Taiwan Straits right now, which is even more dangerous. And it's a very similar playbook, by the way, which is we prevaricate and make all sorts of miserable provocations over the issue of Taiwan, escalate. When China says don't do that, then the Speaker of the House flies into Taiwan, great move, raising the stakes further, now military incursions every day. And then we say, well, we're going to arm them to the teeth, make them the Porcupine Island so that China can't attack. Are you kidding? This is an island of 23 million people. The mainland, I would like to remind everybody, is 1.4 billion people. What are we doing? We really want to have a two-front war here?
Well,
are we really desperate for World War III? What is in the minds of these neocons in the White House and in the Congress and in the think tanks of Washington that don't think? And
exactly. Jeffrey, we know that the White House looks to the Center for New American Security for some of this. I mean, it's just crawling with these neoconservatives who, as you mentioned, are pushing for two large theater simultaneous wars with Russia and China. My last question is, what about this idea that some of the leading emerging economies, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, might form an effective alliance to institute an alternative currency to the US dollar? Is this a remote possibility? Is this a real possibility? And if so, would it be a game changer and halt this drive for full spectrum dominance of the United States, of the land, of the air, of the sea, of the world?
Well, it's happening already, and for the following reason. The US dollar for the last 50 years was the convenient global currency. It was the currency in which you denominated international transactions. It was the currency in which you settled international transactions. It was the currency in which you stored value, held foreign exchange reserves. It was the global key currency. This has given the US lots of advantages, the ability to borrow at lowest cost in the world, the ability to have a lot of freedom of maneuver of our monetary policy, and other privileges of being the world's key currency. But then somebody got the not very bright idea that we could turn this economic advantage, which was undoubted, into a geopolitical military advantage. We could militarize the role of the US dollar. And so we started to politicize and in effect militarize the dollar by confiscating the foreign exchange reserves of countries we don't like, Venezuela or Afghanistan. After we left, we kept their foreign exchange reserves. And then with Russia, something on the order of freezing $300 billion of their foreign exchange reserves, and then imposing sanctions outside of the UN framework and so forth. But we're doing that everywhere now, not just with Russia, but as what they think is a cheap foreign policy tool. You know, you don't have to declare war. You don't even have to explain anything to the American people. You don't need a congressional approval. You don't need appropriations. You just sign a piece of paper. And lo and behold, you have this powerful instrument. But you know what? Everyone else is understanding this. So they don't want to go through the US dollar banking system anymore. They don't want to leave their money in US dollars. And while they can't end the US dollar role overnight, we're seeing all over the world that countries are finding other ways to make transactions. And that's already happening. And there will be a digital renminbi, it's already in existence, but kind of in the beta run right now. There will be other ways to settle. And this is happening in real time. It's now whether there will be a BRICS currency, they're talking about a BRICS payment system. There could be, but what it really means is alternatives to using the US banking system, alternatives to using the US dollar. And the question is, will that happen? And the answer is definitely it will happen, because it's already happening, and because there's nothing unique about using the dollar for settlements. It is convenient when much of the world, maybe 60 or 70% of settlements are done that way. And it's good for our banks and the business, and it's good for the US economy, but you can't have your currency.
Okay. All right. Well, he went on for a little while, but I think we got the gist that our currency may not have much currency and that the banking system may be the route in which we see the hand of diplomacy forced, in other words, you know, because the United States dollar is not going to be the currency of the world forever. Okay, at this point, it's 10 minutes before the top of the hour. Anne, or Cole, any thoughts on what you heard?
Well, his analysis of what has to be solved in Ukraine is extremely important. And we don't have to adopt a final solution to the war before we open negotiations. It's important to go into a ceasefire. It's important to get the parties talking and declaring their positions publicly. And then we go from there. It's not going to be easy, but we have to move in the right direction.
We can't have preconditions. You know, in researching this article, Letter to the Left on Ukraine, which Maha posted in the chat, I came across these documents, these joint statements that were signed by Biden and Blinken a couple months apart in 2021. And both documents, they talk about supporting NATO as an enhanced opportunity partner, EOP, so that Ukraine, did I say Ukraine, their military is integrated into the NATO command structure. So we were completely provoking this. And in addition, these documents talk about how the United States will never recognize Crimea as a part of Russia, and that we are committed to restoring the territorial integrity via arms of Ukraine. So this was provocation. All right, Anne.
I would just like to say, we're in for a long ride on this thing, and whatever we can do as citizens to put pressure on our Congress, to put pressure on the administration, we really have to do it, because we're already in midst of one war in Europe, and the potential for things happening in China is so great. So everybody get ready, start getting ready to write, to call, to demonstrate out in front of offices, to try to stop this warmongering crap that's been going on forever, it seems. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I want to urge everybody who's listening to join us at the Peace in Ukraine Coalition. Cole and I are on the steering committee. It's peaceinukraine.org. We've got lots of resources for doing exactly what Anne mentioned, getting out in front of your congressperson's office, demanding an end to all of these arms shipments. Another $37 billion is on the table. By the time the year is out, the U.S., we anticipate will spend over $100 billion on Ukraine. And as Chas Freeman said, with absolutely no clue about how they're going to bring this to a resolution. All right, so do check out peaceinukraine.org. Join us for our calls twice a month. It's starting this month, the first and third Wednesday of the month. Okay, now it's time to take some action. And this action, the second action, you'll need your cell phone. This is to call Capitol Hill, your congressperson, and say, vote no on the military budget, the National Defense Authorization Act. There it is in the chat, NDAA. What, it's like 850, here's 850 billion. I think it's more. Cole said 858 billion. They keep adding billions to it. Do we really need to spend another 35 to 40 billion on nuclear weapons, on nuclear rearmament? Do we need billions to prepare for a war with China? No. How do we stop this? We have to be vocal. We have to be a lot louder. So let's start. Let's call. Maha's going to play some music. Number is 202-224-3121. Hi, this is Marcy Winograd, coordinator of CODEPINK Congress. I'm done. How are we doing? We're good. Okay, Maha, I think we're done with that portion. I just want to, on behalf of my co-host, thank you all for joining us tonight. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. We are going to be back on December 20th, but earlier in the day, we have a program that's we're partnering with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in the United States, and they have a program they've organized on AFRICOM, U.S. out of Africa. So I'm looking forward to that, and we'll let you know when that is. And then we'll start up the new year, as Cole mentioned, with a terrific program on Palestine, what's going on there. Always the first and third Tuesday of the month. Cole, Brian, Ann, want to say goodbye?
Thanks, everyone, and let's get peace in Ukraine.
Amen. I'm going to be on that webinar,
Oh, yeah.
AFRICOM. So I hope everybody tunes in to that one. Thank you.
That's right. Yeah. And just lastly, a reminder, join our peaceinukraine.org coalition. Visit the CODEPINK website, codepink.org, to see various actions that we posted on the front page, including one that allows you to send with one click a message to your congressperson, vote no on the 37 billion more that we're being asked to give to Ukraine, 22 billion of which would be for weapons. All right, with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. It's been great to be with you. We have a community here, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Save the chat.